main character Ade, the mother, every time she appears, she is tagged as a Kongaya. A Kongaya goes into labor with no hospital, no doctor, and no idea how long it will take. Just the women who came before a Kongaya, sitting close, breathing with her. No machines, no medicine, no guarantee a Kongaya survives the night. For most of human history, this wasn't a horror story. This was simply how every single person alive got here. Today, giving birth is one of the safest medical events a body can go through. Back then, it was one of the most dangerous. Anthropologist Wenda Trev Athen has spent decades studying how human birth evolved, and her research points to something striking. Human babies are born with unusually large heads relative to the size of the birth canal. Why? Because at some point, a Kongaya's ancestors started walking upright on two legs, which narrowed the pelvis. Right around the same time, their brains started getting bigger. Two evolutionary trends, pulling in opposite directions, colliding inside every birth. So how did anyone survive that contradiction? They survived it together. This is where the story gets interesting. Trevathan proposed something now widely accepted in anthropology. Human birth almost certainly required assistance, far earlier and far more consistently than birth in any other primate. Chimpanzees give birth alone in trees and silence. Humans likely never did. Kongaya's ancestors needed help, and that need for help may have shaped human social bonds themselves. Picture the scene. Kongaya crouches near a fire, gripping the shoulders of another woman behind her. Two more sit in front, watching, waiting, ready to catch the baby. There is no silence here. There is talking, low chanting, maybe a specific birth song passed down only between women. Anthropologist Bruxelza, who has studied birth practices among the Himba people of Namibia, documented exactly this kind of communal, vocal, deeply social process. Other women weren't optional extras. They were the entire safety net, and that safety net mattered because the dangers were real and constant. Obstructed labor, breech position, hemorrhage, no way to perform a cesarean, no antibiotics if infection set in afterward. Estimates drawn from skeletal and ethnographic studies of pre-industrial and hunter-gatherer populations suggest maternal mortality could run into the low hundreds of deaths per mochum births, sometimes higher, compared to roughly Jaime per mochum in each wealthy countries today. Childbirth wasn't just painful. It was one of the leading causes of death for women of reproductive age for almost all of human history. So what actually happened in the hours after birth? There was no nursery, no crib, no quiet room to recover in. Newborns were carried constantly against bare skin almost every waking and sleeping hour. Anthropologist James McKenna, who has spent his career studying mother-infant sleep, found that this constant body contact wasn't just comfort. It regulated the baby's breathing, heart rate, and body temperature directly because a newborn's own systems weren't yet stable enough to do it alone. Skin against skin wasn't tenderness for its own sake. It was a second nervous system borrowed from a Kongaya, keeping the baby alive. Let's reconstruct a single day. Kongaya wakes before sunrise, her baby already wrapped against her chest in a sling made of hide or woven bark. She walks to gather food, the baby moving with every step, soothed by motion the same way it was soothed inside her. She nurses on demand, sometimes a dozen times a day. No schedule, no clock, just the baby's hunger as the only signal that matters. At night, the baby sleeps pressed against a Kongaya, within arm's reach, within breath's reach, because in a world with predators, cold, and no walls, distance meant danger. And the village did not leave a Kongaya to do this alone. Anthropologist Sarah A., in her influential work on human cooperative breeding, argued that human infants required something almost no other species needed: a network of caregivers beyond just the mother, aunts, grandmothers, older siblings, even unrelated group members, all sharing the load of holding, feeding, and protecting infants. Taggart calls these alamothers helpers who are not the biological mother, but who care for the child anyway. Without them, she argues, the uniquely slow, expensive, big-brained human child might never have survived long enough to grow up at all. Here's the counterintuitive twist. You might assume that without modern parenting advice, Ancient mothers like Aya were guessing, improvising, doing everything wrong by accident. The opposite seems closer to true. Constant carrying, demand feeding, co-sleeping, and a wide circle of caregivers are not primitive shortcuts. They appear to be the conditions the human infant brain actually evolved to expect. Modern researchers studying infant stress and attachment, building on decades of work following HRD and McKenna, have found that babies separated from constant contact show higher stress hormone levels and more disrupted sleep. The ancient default wasn't a lesser version of modern tan. In some ways, it was the original blueprint, and modern parenting is the improvisation, stretched thin without the village it was designed to need, which raises an uncomfortable mirror for today's parents. Now, a new mother is often handed a baby, a manual, and a closed front door. One person alone expected to do what once took 4 or 5 people working in shifts around the clock the way it once took for a Kong Aya. No alamothers down the hall. A circle of women who already know exactly what to do because they've done it themselves and watched it done 100 times before. The isolation many new parents describe today isn't a personal failure. It's a structural one, the absence of a system that every human infant for hundreds of thousands of years was born expecting to have. There's another layer to this that rarely gets mentioned. Pregnancy itself was not a private, individual experience the way it often is now. Women like Aya in hunter-gatherer and small-scale societies typically gave birth multiple times across their lives, often spaced years apart, partly because mere constant breastfeeding suppresses ovulation. This wasn't planning in the modern sense. It was biology and culture working together. Spacing out the enormous physical cost of pregnancy and birth saw Aya's body had time to recover before doing it again. Anthropologists studying populations like the Hadza of Tanzania and the Kung of the Kalahari, including long-term fieldwork associated with researchers such as Nancy Howell, found birth intervals often stretching 3 to 4 years. Shaped directly by this breastfeeding pattern combined with the physical demands of carrying and feeding a mobile, foraging lifestyle. Think about what that meant for Aya's daily life. She wasn't caring for one infant in isolation. She might be carrying a newborn while a 3-year-old walked beside her, while an older child helped gather food nearby, while a grandmother minded a toddler back at camp. Childhood itself looked different because of this. Older siblings weren't just playmates. They were junior caregivers, often handling infants from a remarkably young age, learning the exact skills they would need themselves within a decade or two. A 6-year-old holding a baby wasn't unusual. It was training. Now think about what happened when something went wrong, because something inevitably did. A difficult labor, a baby position wrong, a mother losing too much blood. Without modern intervention, the people around her became the only intervention available. Skeletal evidence from sites studied by bioarchaeologists shows healed pelvic fractures and signs of trauma consistent with difficult births that women survived, meaning some group of hands, got them through it. There was no version of childbirth that didn't depend entirely on other people showing up for someone like Aya. This dependence on others didn't end once the baby was born safely. It arguably became even more important. A newborn human is, biologically speaking, almost absurdly helpless. Compared to other primates, human infants are born less developed, with brains that will roughly triple in size over the following years, mostly outside the womb. Some researchers describe this as a kind of 4th trimester, an extension of the womb experience into the outside world, where constant contact, motion, warmth, and feeding aren't luxuries but biological continuations of pregnancy itself. Strip away the modern conveniences and what you're left with is a creature that simply cannot regulate its own body without a caregiver close by hour after hour, day after day. This is precisely why Sarah HRD's cooperative breeding theory carries so much weight. She argues that this extreme infant helplessness, combined with the years it takes a human child to become even partially self-sufficient, would have been an impossible burden for one mother like Akong Aya to carry alone, while also gathering food, avoiding predators, and surviving everything else daily life demanded. The math simply doesn't work without help. A mother foraging for food needed someone to hold the baby. A mother recovering from birth needed someone to bring her food. A mother exhausted, too, in the morning needed another set of arms. The species essentially could not exist without distributed caregiving built directly into its social structure. There's a quieter detail in all of this that might be the most revealing part. In many of these societies, infants were almost never put down to cry alone, not as a parenting philosophy, but because there was almost nowhere safe to put them down. No crib, no playpen, no locked door separating baby from danger. The baby stayed against a body, any trusted body, because the ground held real threats and because the entire culture assumed an infant alone was an infant at risk. Crying itself functioned differently in that context. It wasn't background noise to be managed. It was an alarm meant to be answered immediately, because in an environment with no walls and no safety net beyond human attention, an unanswered cry could mean something was actually wrong. Here is the counterintuitive twist. You might assume that without modern parenting advice, ancient mothers like a calm Aya were guessing, improvising, doing everything wrong by accident, saved only by luck. The opposite seems closer to true. Constant carrying, demand feeding, co-sleeping, wide birth spacing, and a deep circle of caregivers were not primitive shortcuts born of ignorance. They appear to be the conditions the human infant brain actually evolved to expect. Refined over hundreds of thousands of years simply because they worked. Modern researchers studying infant stress and attachment, building on decades of work from HRD and McKenna, have found that babies separated from constant contact tend to show higher stress hormone levels and more disrupted sleep patterns. The ancient default wasn't a lesser, unscientific version of modern parenting. In some ways, it was the original blueprint, and modern parenting is the improvisation, stretched thin without the village it was always designed to need. Which raises an uncomfortable mirror for today. A new mother is often handed a baby, a manual, and a closed front door. One person, frequently alone, expected to do what once took 4 or 5 people working in coordinated shifts around the clock, exactly as it did for a Kalmaya. No alamothers down the hall. No circle of women who already know exactly what to do because they've done it themselves and watched it done 100 times before, starting back when they themselves were 6 years old holding someone else's baby. The isolation many new parents describe today isn't a personal failure, and it isn't a sign of doing something wrong. It's a structural gap, the absence of a support system that every human infant, for nearly all of human history, was born expecting to have waiting for it. So the next time you see an exhausted new parent, or you are one yourself, remember what birth and infancy actually required for nearly all of human history. The same things it required for Okong Aya, not independence, not self-sufficiency, not doing it all alone, and calling that strength, cooperation, constant contact, and a circle of hands that simply never let the baby go. Ekam Aya goes into labor and the room is not empty. It never was, not for Mochum years, and maybe despite everything that's changed since, it was never supposed to be.